take their Bibles
Everything that we do now.
and put them under your chairs.
What? The Bible's under the chairs?
Bibles under the chairs.
Bible under the chair.
Nobody has any scripture
Oh, that's right.
or writings.
Oh.
Nothing.
So we gotta listen, yeah.
Okay.
Good job.
Has anybody ever seen pictures of Greece before?
Yes.
Has anybody ever been to Greece?
No.
No. I would love
My
that.
sister has.
If you know what Greece likes, picture it in your head. Rocky, shrubs, the beautiful Mediterranean Sea, and then think of the ruins that you see on the pictures of Greece. The houses that people lived in were stone, close together in the urban areas, and then lots of orchards, farmland with olives and grapes, and those types of things. There was also a lot of ruins, because even in Paul's day, most of the Greek temples, the gods they worshipped and things were already destroyed or ruined. They weren't standing then. So what we're going to do today is learn a little bit about the Thessalonians and the history of Thessalonica, or Thessalonica. And I think, to me, it's become important to know what is happening at the time that the people, where Paul was, what is going on in the culture, what's going on in the people's minds, what do they know, what don't they know about God, and everything else that's happening in their lives. Because all those things speak directly to how Paul, or part of how Paul wrote his letters. Most of the things, or many of the things in his letters, are attributed to things that were going on at the time in the area. And it just gives you a much, I've said this before, it gives you a much deeper understanding. And it really makes it alive to you in your mind, especially if you have a good imagination, you can imagine some things going on. And all this information today is really easy to find on the computer. Of course, you can go to the library and look it up too. So what I did is I just took some time and looked some things up. And what I'd like you to do is just try to forget what you know. It's impossible to do, I know, but try, as we're doing this, to forget what you know already about Thessalonians and what Paul was doing. Because the people that he went to in Thessalonica the first time, most of them only knew very little. The Greeks probably not much at all. And the Jewish people had their Jewish faith that they believed in, which was that Jesus was not the Christ. We also read in Paul's epistles how, we were just talking about that, Priscilla and Aquila.
Yes.
And they were baptized under John the Baptist. Not John the Baptist himself, but that belief. So they didn't even know that Christ was here yet. So word travels very slowly. It is widely thought that Thessalonians, First Thessalonians, was probably the first book written of the New Testament. And that wasn't written until 20-some years after Christ's death. So it took time, a long time, for word to travel up for where people were, from around Jerusalem when all that happened. That's where Christ's ministry was, in that area. Okay. And that's what people saw. The people there knew what was going on, most of them, because of, word travels in there. But to get further north or south, it took a very long time.
Excuse me, teacher. We have somebody with a non-existent Bible in their lap.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh. Oh, who's that?
Bible goes under the chair.
Yep, Bible's on the chairs.
She came in late.
No Bibles.
I got a question, as long as he interrupted. I wasn't aware that back in those days, when they wore the toga, that they wore trousers and shirts.
I did look up the garb of the day, and the Greek men wore a folded garment, similar to a sheet, down to about their knees or higher. Women wore the same thing, but longer. And they wore, like in the summertime or warmer months, they just would have worn something simple like this draped over. Other times of year, they had jackets with sleeves.
Yeah.
So when you see, like today, you see pictures of the people in Greece or Turkey, with their hats and all have their robe and everything on, and then they have like a sleeved jacket over them. That was common back then, because as we'll see, the weather that we have right now is pretty much the weather they're having over there. So we'll get started. Thessaloniki was established in about 315 by Cassander. Alexander the Great did not leave any successors to his massive empire. When it was broken up quickly by wars, the people taking over. Cassander was the husband of Alexander's half-sister, and her name was Thessaloniki. Her name came from, it's a Macedonian name. It came after a Macedonian battle, which the Macedonians won, and she was born. I forget the name of the place that they took. And her name means victory. So that's what the town was named after. There were other settlements in the area before it was built up that it took place of. It was a free city, even under Macedonian rule, it had its own parliament and governed itself. And then when Rome took over, they were still allowed to maintain their free city status, where they had their own government and their own rules. So they still had to follow after the Roman rule as well, but they were able to govern themselves more. That happened about 41 BC. Thessaloniki was a very important city of trade. In Macedonian times, it was their second most important city. And in Roman times, in that area, again, still second most important. Today, it is still called Thessaloniki. Some people call it Saloniki. And it's home to over 1 million people. So it was a very sprawling urban area. And even back then, it was very sprawling. Not as urban, largely urban more than other places, but still largely farmland. The Romans built a road, many roads, you know, right? The Ignatia Way was a road that went right through Thessaloniki, which made it a huge trade center. It also had a road that went north into the Balkans, which allowed the Romans and the Greeks to trade with people in the Balkan states. And it had a seaport, a very large one. So it was a very huge center of trade. A lot of different nationalities of people and products went through Thessaloniki. It had a very large Jewish population, as it does today. I was actually very surprised today. I looked up some census data, and the majority of the people that live there are of Jewish ancestry. The Greek ancestry there is actually pretty small. It's mostly Jewish and Muslim or Arab.
But they call themselves Greek? They call themselves Greek there?
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah, today they're Greek, but their ancestry,
No.
because through the years, that was the population was largely Jewish. So Paul, one of the reasons he didn't stay at the two cities he went through first, Apollonia being one, was because they didn't have a large synagogue and didn't have a large Jewish population. And that was always his first thing to go into a city was to reason with the Jews. The weather there, as I said, is similar to ours, except they get a lot less rain. Their rainfall a year is about 17 inches. Over around 3,000 days, that's impossible. About 3,000 days. It's mostly sun. I forget what the 3,000 was hours or, but it's almost always sunny. Very few cloudy days, so there's not a lot of rain. Farming was a big thing in those areas in Greece, but it was very difficult. This is why most of what they grew was grapes and olives. They did grow some other things, but not as much, just because of the difficulty.
Grapes and olives don't need a lot of rain. Grapes and olives don't need a lot of rain.
Right, yeah, they're easier, olive trees, they grow in, as long as the climate's right, they grow in almost anything. The Jewish population grew livestock mostly. That was their thing. They were, shepherds, but it was more than sheep. So food was a large thing as far as their trade. In the urban area, there were many things traded also, pottery, textiles, metals, and those types of things. It was a very hustling and bustling urban area. And about a little about the people and the culture. Found some very interesting things. They were very passionate people about what they believed in. They were very inquisitive. As I said, the ruins, many of the ancient ruins from ancient Greece and the gods they worshipped, most of them were fallen out of disrepair or from wars. They weren't rebuilt, though the Greeks in that area still worshipped and followed some of those rites, sacrifices, and those things. It was ripe for change. There was a lot of thought, a lot of philosophy going on that was changing some of those beliefs. And they were very open, the Greeks were, to new things. Because their past was starting to dwindle, and they were starting to become more open to accept new things in culture. And of course, they also had the Romans. And the Romans also, we know, had a lot of gods and goddesses and rituals. So there was a big mix. And then you had the big Jewish population with the synagogue. So there was a very diverse thought and range of beliefs in Thessaloniki and throughout most of Greece. They were really into drama. That was a big thing for them. Well, if you look at anything about archaeology, you'll see they're always finding theaters, amphitheaters. The interesting thing I learned was that women in Greece were similar to women in Israel and other parts of the world. They were very lowly thought of. They were mostly relegated to housework, or if the family had a business, they worked in the family business. Women were not allowed to attend theater or drama, or any political or philosophical discussions or events. Only men could attend the theater, and only men could act in the theater. If it was a woman's part, the men had to play the woman's part. One of the things that Paul speaks about often is sexual immorality, which was very rampant in Greece and Rome. The Greeks didn't even see a difference between men and women sexually. They didn't. It wasn't like today. We know that there's differences that some people feel they have, and when people look at it today, it's kind of like, oh, some people are becoming more and more accepting of it. But then there was no thought whatsoever of what was going on. And women in that vein were also treated fairly poorly. So you can kind of see where Paul sometimes talks about, the women keeping their head covered, don't speak. It wasn't just because of Jewish tradition. That was the thought in the world at that time. Paul was actually a radical in that way in regards to women, compared to what other people thought. So today we read Paul and we think, wow, look at how we thought about women. But really, in that time, the way he thought about women, other probably people looked at him and said, what are you talking about? Women shouldn't be allowed to do this or that. So, sports, there's a lot of sporting events. We know about the Olympics from Greece. Again, only men played sports, and men played sports naked. So women were never allowed to watch sports. So when they had their Olympic Games, there was no women. It was all men. When young boys played sports, all the girls had to go inside or go away so they could play their sports. So women weren't even allowed to do that. There were a lot of other games. Checkers was very popular. It wasn't checkers as we think of, but the game backgammon came from Greek checkers. So those types of things were also very popular, games about thinking and strategy. Corinth, which was somewhat nearby at the time, just to talk about immorality. Corinth was thought of as a cesspool of drunkenness and immorality and whatever else, because it was also a major port, a major trade area, much larger population, and just due to its location was more of a center. A lot of sailors would go there and spend their evenings or days or winters and carouse around the town and have a good time. That was a common saying back then throughout Greece, that if you were a person like that, they would call you a Corinthian. Or they would rebuke you and say, don't be such a Corinthian. If you were a heavy drinker somewhere in Greece, they would call you a Corinthian, because that's what they thought was a Corinthian. Which, of course, when you're reading Corinthians, you can tell that Paul's really getting after them about some things. Their worship was polytheistic. They had many gods in Greece and in the Romans. Romans. The Greeks believed that even their gods had a fate. So even though they held their gods in very high esteem, even they had someone to answer to. They just didn't say who it was. The Greeks, that's where philosophy started to come in and trying to figure out what else there was besides the gods. The universe was like a giant river. The earth was flat and floated in the river. And the earth was part of Uranus. It was broken off so that it could have children. And there's a big long other story to that, which I read, which is really cool, but we don't have time for it. Most of their theology came from Hesiod. I don't know if that's the proper way to say that. But he had something called the theogony. And that's where they got their creation from, their gods from, and their ways of, most of their ways of religious worship. They believed heavily in monsters, and spirits, and supernatural beings, which of course you read in a lot of the old Greek literature. But the people really, it wasn't just literature, it was a belief. You know, people believed that. Now in the time of Paul's time, again, that was starting to fade a little bit. Though people still believed it and worshipped it, they were more open to other things. Plato advanced the theory of this immortality of the soul. The Greeks are the ones who started advancing that. Of course, in Greece, that wasn't always widely believed either, but it was a very common belief. Some philosophers believed in reincarnation. So like I said, there's a lot of different things floating around. They did perform sacrifices, rituals, and they traveled to festivals of different types to worship their gods. They did not believe that afterlife was that important. The people who were really bad went to Tartarus and they were punished. The people who were average went to Hades, where they were dead. And the people who were really, really good, or very distinguished, went to the Elysian fields, where they got to live in paradise with the gods. So most people, to them, we mentioned a while ago when we were in one of the lessons we did about, I mentioned a couple of philosophers that were telling the Thessalonians, hey, it doesn't matter. When you're dead, you're dead. So, you know, all this just doesn't matter. Yes?
Question.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, it's more of a comment. I was watching History Channel program. It was about the gods and all that stuff of Greece, right? And we were just talking about Hades and all that. And I found, on the History Channel, they found a place that could be described as what they thought was Hades, because it had 3 levels. It was a cave.
Mm-hmm.
And one area was the upper area, and it actually was grassy because it had light open from the top of the cave. But the bottom areas were all just water and had all those icy holes and all that stuff, and it was all over the place, and it was just really a mess. And they thought, and that's what they thought was Hades.
Cool. They find lots of good stuff.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things of that is many of the areas in Greece where Paul went today don't exist anymore. So archaeology is able to dig it up and find neat things. Thessalonica is not like that. It was always built up over top of its ruins. So today, if they demolish a building or they're doing something, sometimes those areas will be set aside and they let archaeologists look for something. Other than that, it's just built on top of each other and just continues. So that's one of the reasons. When you look up Thessalonica, a lot of times there's just not a lot of information about the archaeology and things. And sometimes you have to take it from what else was going on in Greece at the time. Okay, so what I want to do now that you have an idea of what was happening there, what people were doing, what they knew, this is a letter from the Apostle Paul to the Thessalonians that were believers. One of the neat things about Thessalonians was that they were once they learned from Paul, even after his first visit, when they had no writings or scripture, they still went through Macedonia and spread the word. So this scroll would have been, by scribes, redone countless times and passed out to the other groups throughout Macedonia. So the letters that Paul wrote, except for, like ones like to Timothy, these letters were spread out through the area, through the many believers. And as I said, Thessalonica was one of the first to get something like this. I rolled it the wrong way.
Uh-oh.
It's long.
A long letter.
Paul is a very long story.
You had to get a lot in.
He did. I just rolled the other way as I do it now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read this like someone in the church or that group, that I know, Ecclesia, would have read it. So they would have gathered together. They probably went out to everybody in the neighborhood and people they knew, sent letters or whatever, and got everybody together. I don't know how big the group was, or where they might have read something like this. I don't know if they found some place like large to do it, or if they just did it in someone's home. This is a translation. It's done through a course on Taking Coffee with Paul, and the man who does it, Gary Collier, he did this. It's written in a way that we would get a letter today. So it's, you know, it's not, it's theologically, doctrinally sound, but the wording is a lot easier to understand something like we might get. One of the things in the course that I've learned is that it's important to do all this, to know what is happening. And the other thing that he always recommends is that you try to forget things you've learned in the past. Always start with what you have and take it from there. Get this really down, then go out to other parts of Scripture. Because it's important to know, again, when they had this, this is what they had. They didn't have anything else. Of course, there were Jews that were believers too, and they did have beliefs already. But very few, even in that time, had a physical copy of something to read. It was always at the temple, where it was read by the Pharisees. You know, maybe they went home and wrote some stuff down that they remembered, but that was it. I need the, hopefully it won't take me too long to read it. I imagine it must have been kind of exciting too, right? I mean, Paul was there for a couple months.
Yeah.
He talked to all these people and then he left. And that's what they had. They had the information he left with. And then he got word of what was going on, so he wanted to shore up their beliefs. Sent them Timothy, who was also a new believer, right?
Mm-hmm.
But Paul saw something in him that he was going to be a good guy to hang around.
Well, the Greeks they like new things, you know, the philosophers. But I'm sure once he left, there was much discussion of what was said.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Probably a lot of
a
discussion.
lot of debates about what's right or wrong, or what they believe, what they don't believe.
Right, there's right a lot of intermingling between
And that's a good thing.
what the Jews believed, what the Greeks believed. You know, so a lot of things start getting intermixed. So, you know, thank God for them that they were able to have Paul come back and say, wait a minute, and then we still have this today. You know, so we can see it. The interesting thing about Thessalonians too is that there is nothing about justification, reconciliation, or any of that either. It's a very, to me, it's a very simple, plain, straightforward, which is kind of nice. You know, he held the Thessalonians in some pretty good regard, since he didn't have to go through all that with them, because they already, you know, they knew about it.